Good morning. Today on the lunch series, we've got Dr. Angela McClure with us. She is an extension professor and corn and soybean specialist. She is based at the research station in Jackson. So today her topic is going to be our current corn and soybean conditions here in Tennessee. So thank you, Dr. McClure, for joining us for today's session.
All right, well, thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here, and just wanted to, I guess, take a little bit of time and talk about corn and soybeans, kind of what went on this spring and kind of what we're looking at as we start to transition into summer, at least on the calendar. I think temperature-wise, we've already hit summer. And I thought I'd wrap up just to take a couple of minutes to talk about Dicamba and the Dicamba label change and some of the Dicamba situation. So I may go ahead and start with corn. You know, I know last year you could probably have just thrown seed out on the ground and gotten a great yield. It was a fantastic year for corn. It was, warmer in the spring, good moisture, ideal temperatures, great yields, and we set a new record for Tennessee. But those of you know that this year is not the same. We have faced a lot of challenges this year. I think one of the most extended wet springs that we've had in a couple of years, where we just have not been able to, get in timely and plant both corn and beans. And so we're going to see some challenges, and I think we're looking at a corn crop that has had more stress on it this spring than we've seen, in the past year or so. And a lot of that is rain, but this year we also had cool temperatures. So that cold weather in May, impacted corn, but rainfall was the big one. This is just rainfall from Milan, and you kind of look at the last 4 years, and I've updated it for 2020. And April, not too bad. I mean, we had plenty of rain. March, I don't have March on here, but Milan, I think, had almost 8 inches of rain in March. So that was huge. But a lot of rain in May. And in June, they started off, kind of average, but, we're starting to pick up some rain this week. So the wet weather, the cool weather, I think impacted things like the way the corn looks, skippier stands, more corn that's not the same size because it came up at different times. A few more replant calls this year compared to, for example, last year. And, some other issues just kind of associated with wet weather. And when I went to the Tennessee Ag Statistics site and kind of looked at percent planted acres by month, you can see that we're looking at a lot of May corn. And, most of our corn is not irrigated. And one way to work around the heat and the dry weather is we try to plant early. And so we try to start in March. But the last couple of years, we haven't had a lot of success. If March isn't an option, April's is still a really good fit. And then we start looking at May. Well, this year, I think we got a lot of late May corn. We've got corn that was planted, I think, last week on some of the better ground. Or in some cases, guys had anhydrous and they didn't have an option. They had to go back with corn. Or they've got irrigation. That's an option. Early June corn is not ideal, but we can make a crop, certainly with irrigation. But the bottom line is, we're looking at managing a lot of late corn acres. And so because of that, and because I think of the cold weather and the wet weather, we're looking at stress, and we're probably not going to be looking at a 2019 yield. I don't think that's news to anybody. We're probably looking at an average year, an average yield. And so this would be kind of one of those years where farmers want to manage the crop, but not just pour a lot of extras into it, do some good basic things and do things on time to protect yield. But this, again, we're probably not looking at, kind of a record year for us. As far as kind of what's going on right now. I know folks have been putting their nitrogen out or in the process of trying to get nitrogen out, and some corn is not quite ready for nitrogen. So we got kind of all different scenarios. But, you know, the thing with an average yield crop, you know, we want to fertilize it. We can't do without nitrogen. And so folks need to get in there, hopefully before about B6, and try to get their lay-by or their side dress nitrogen on. Most years, if they're broadcasting urea on the surface, if they are spraying UAN over the top of corn, and we do have some people that do that, that's how they put it out, or even laying that UAN on top of the surface kind of as a row middle type application, we typically suggest adding some kind of a surface volatilization loss product. Like, so anything with the active ingredient NBPT, which is what Agritane type products are based on. And there are a lot of generic products out there as well. Anvol is a new one from the company that first came out with Agritane, and it's supposed to be a kind of an enhanced or a little bit better type product. But the idea is that if you're sitting it on top of the ground and you don't have rain in sight, you know, these basically kind of buy you some time until we can get some rain. These are some shots from some plot work that we did at Milan, and we had nitrogen going out on corn at different times. And in this particular case, we lucked out because we put our nitrogen out and we got rain about 2 days later, which is kind of ideal for kind of working that surface applied stuff in. So if you've got rain coming, you know, 2 to 3 days after application, you know, it does a good job, I think, getting the nitrogen down in the ground. We don't worry about surface loss. If you've got no rain in the forecast, then, you know, they may want to look at penciling in some kind of a surface loss protection type product. The shot at the top, this is a little UAN rig that basically sprays UAN down in the ground behind a coulter. This type of application, we really don't need a stabilizer. It kind of it's a self-stabilizing type system because you're not putting it on top of the ground, you're putting it down in the ground. Some of the soil helps cover that nitrogen up, and we see very little benefit most years putting anything with that type of system. So putting it down in the ground is always safe and much more stable. If you're putting it on top of the ground, once we get into June, you know, we start looking at whether or not we want to spend a couple of pennies on some of these products. Because it's a wet year, I've had probably more calls this spring about these products that are called denitrification inhibitors. And nitrogen, when it's applied, urea, for example, it will break down and form nitrate eventually. And nitrate is not held by the soil very tightly because it's got a kind of a net negative charge. So you've got a net negative charged molecule, you get some rain, and it tends to leach or wash down. And it can also change into other forms that lose nitrogen. So had a lot of questions about whether to include, you know, some of these types of products. And usually, you know, with these products, we target more at planting. For example, anhydrous UAN or urea that's going out at planting, you know, where we tend to have a good bit more rain. Sometimes, you know, these are useful. And basically, they kind of slow that conversion of urea to nitrate. So they're kind of reducing the nitrate load and then kind of buying time so that, you know, that maybe you're going to have some dry weather and, you know, just kind of reduce I guess, the nitrate load concentration at one particular time. So, you know, not usually something that we recommend for side dress or lay-by type applications, unless it's just, you know, we're going into just like a really, really wet situation, a poorly drained field, rain in the forecast, you know. And I have not priced some of these products just, you know, just because we don't do as much work with them. But there are a couple of products like Agritane Plus and Super U, which is like a urea that's kind of coated with both an NBPT type product and a denitrification inhibitor. Agritane Plus is a liquid that you use to treat fertilizer, and it also has kind of both type materials. So it's considered protection in a dry year or a wet year, but they do cost more money. So farmers that are interested in some of these, maybe talk to the retailers and kind of see where they are price-wise. Again, if you're not looking at a lot of rain, but you're looking at some rain, these denitrification inhibitors this time of year might be where I would probably save some money, unless there was just a really darn good reason to really think about, including some of those. So I think, this year, a lot of calls and field visits that I've made have been related to the wet weather. Replants, nutrient deficiencies showing up. Some of these are just kind of aggravated by wet weather. Some cases it's herbicide injury and not, nutrient, sometimes vice versa. So kind of ballpark, or just kind of all over the board as far as these types of things. The two pictures at the top of this slide are some plots that we have in Jackson. And we did some work for a company. They have a couple of products that contain sulfur. And they asked us to take a look at them. And, we said, well, okay, we put these out. This is a field right there by the main building there in Jackson. And this is a field that didn't have sulfur applied. It was fairly low in sulfur. It was very wet. We got in there as soon as we could to plant, and it was not ideal conditions. You can still see the furrow open in some of these wetter areas. Our corn was a little skippy. And we started seeing this yellowing and this symptomology show up fairly quickly. A couple of other things that we did in this field, we put all of our nitrogen out at planting, which is not something a producer normally would do, but it was what the company asked us to do. And so I think it's that a lot of nitrogen that I think it seems to me when we get in a situation like this, it actually competes with sulfur for uptake. So the corn's taking the nitrogen up, it's not taking the sulfur up. And if you don't have much sulfur in the soil to begin with, then you get really deficient and you end up with this really yellow, flash, stunted corn. So we got some really striking images here related to sulfur. This is a plot with no sulfur. This is a plot that had some sulfur, and you can see just a huge difference in size. And I meant to get out this morning and try to take an updated field shot because you can still see some height differences in the corn. Where we didn't have, or where we didn't apply sulfur, it looks better, but the corn is still stunted and a little bit off color. So, just kind of one of those years, wet field, the corn roots aren't growing, hard for them to take up micronutrients and things like sulfur. And then we put just a slug of nitrogen on. But I've seen sulfur deficiency show up in a number of fields, in the last couple of weeks, and where there's sulfur in the soil and, with a little heat, and as the corn grows, it'll start accessing what's in the ground. And a lot of times it will turn around and look better. This particular field, I think our sulfur level is so low, we're going to have probably some stunting, and I would expect some yield issues at the end of the year. So other things that I've looked at, I think zinc deficiency in a couple of spots, what we think is manganese deficiency, but we've sent some tissue samples off. So that's kind of in a nutshell for me, as far as the things that I'm seeing or looking at. Are y'all getting any calls about anything in particular related to corn right now outside of what I've talked about? Or okay, everybody may be muted. Well, I'm going to keep going. So,
Angela, no,
yeah.
To answer your question, not much. So much of it was put in late. Thought that graph you showed about how much corn was planted in May is probably accurate down here. I know there was some put in a lot later than it was anticipated. What do you think has been the replant? What percent of acres got replanted this year? You got any kind of a guess?
To me, the replant acres are fairly low. Part of that is because a lot of folks waited out the cold weather or the worst. You know, they weren't happy about when they planted, but they just kind of kept the seed in the bag. So I don't think the replant acres were as high as we've had in some years. Some cases, people were just able to spot plant the wettest spots that didn't come up. You know, acreage wise, I think it was actually fairly low in my opinion. Now, it may vary from county to county, but you know, a lot of folks that would have jumped out in March didn't, or that would have jumped out the first 2 weeks of April didn't. They just looked at the forecast and said, no, I'm going to wait, and they waited. And even though the corn did go through some stress, you know, with the cold temperatures and the rain, at least they didn't have a replant. So, any other questions? Well, I know this is not my area, but it just kind of comes in the discussion of late planting. I think y'all that have been in your jobs for a while know what late planting means, usually for corn and for soybeans, which I'll talk about in a minute. Usually we're looking at more disease pressure on that later planted corn and insects. So insect wise, you know, I think, you know, we're growing a lot of BT corn, and so that takes care of the insect issue. But disease, you know, is another concern in corn that's planted in late May and especially in June. So Heather Kelly has a lot of good information on the web about identifying diseases, but based on some of the planting date stuff that I've done in past years, we tend to have more gray leaf spot pressure in our later corn. I think northern corn leaf blight. There's some other foliar diseases that show up. Southern corn rust is one of those that we never know from year to year whether we're going to have it or how widespread it is, but it is one that we do manage with a fungicide if it shows up early enough, and if there's enough out there. So, you know, all of those things kind of come together. We tend to have more disease pressure and sometimes the right environment for those to show up a little bit more on these later planted hybrids. So, you know, producers, if they can, you know, if they know what they planted and they kind of know what the resistance packages are on some of those hybrids, maybe they could see where it's weak and just kind of keep an eye on the field. Whether they're doing it or y'all are checking for them or they got somebody out there scouting, you know, just trying to identify, you know, when the disease comes in and the growth stage of the corn might help them make the decision about whether to spend the money on a fungicide. And this is something that I use a lot, and I know y'all do too, but this is the fungicide efficacy for corn diseases. And, you know, it basically lists the different diseases. I think there's another page that I cut off, but the different products and the effectiveness of these products on diseases as they're rated in Heather's plots at Milan. And so it's a real helpful guide to kind of put you on the right product for the disease. And so we've got options, you know, and with later planted corn, you know, this is probably something we might have to look at a little bit harder is the question of whether to get a fungicide on that field. So let's see. Any other questions about corn? I don't think I had anything else. That I wanted to mention on corn. Let's see here. Yeah, I think I probably covered everything that I needed to in corn. If you think of something, just kind of sing out there. May switch to soybeans here real quick. So, this is the last couple of years. Well, it's last year and this year. This is my best guess at what we're doing on 2020. Some of those numbers might shift a little bit for the 2020, but it's kind of a snapshot of the acres that we've planted, and when those beans went in, how many early versus late, and just kind of like corn. This year we were looking at tremendous number of June planted, if not July planted soybeans. So, some management challenges, with those later beans. And, part of that is we've got, with soybeans, if you plant on the early side, like if you drop in there in April, there are early planting challenges related to moisture and weather. And we had some folks that actually got April planted beans in this year. I was real proud of them. In most cases, they did quite well. I didn't hear of many replants there. They did struggle a little bit. But the later planted beans, anything this month and next month, basically you're dealing with a short season and more heat, and usually not as much water. So it's a lot more challenging to make a crop. One of the things that I'm working on for my Mylan no-till talk is looking at some of our old, planting date maturity group data and trying to summarize some of that for, from the standpoint of variety selection or maturity group selection. And this is, it's got a lot of stuff in it, but just kind of a summary. This is 3 years of maturity group planting date work that we've done at Mylan. We've got the same project in the field this year, so we're going to add a 4th year, and then I'll re-summarize this and look at some other specific things. But the idea is to try to identify, the best maturity group for planting early versus planting late, and kind of helps give a little bit of guidance. So in Tennessee, we used to plant all group 5 beans. And about 20 years ago, folks kind of wised up and figured out that we could actually take northern varieties and plant them here, and they bloom earlier, and we get that indeterminate growth habit, which has a wide flowering window and helps, offset a lot of the dry weather in the summer. And so those would be the 3s and 4s. I added group 2s into this work because we do have a small number of growers that grow group 2 beans. Kind of a real niche fit, basically for August delivery. So if you plant a group 2, you're guaranteed to get an August delivery. It's typically an early bean. It doesn't fit every acre, and it sure doesn't fit every planting date, but it's kind of one of those niche type products. But 4s and 5s and even 3s, I think we've been working with these for a number of years. And the idea behind this work is just try to look at where these different maturity groups have their strengths and weaknesses. So in this, the data in the chart, everything is calculated as a % of maximum yield. And so maximum yield is the best maturity group planting date combination, which in this particular case is early May planted group 4. So we had our highest yields on average over those 3 years, and everything else is relative to it. So a late April group 5 yielded 96% of what the best yielding combination, in our data set. And that's kind of how this is set up. So the idea is that as you look across, you can kind of see how everything compares, and then the amount of decline in yield as you plant later and later. So within a planting date, within a column, the cells that are highlighted are basically the best fit maturity groups for that planting window. So late April, any of these worked really well. Early May, statistically, these were all the same, although the 4s, I think, were superior to everything else. Late May, it's kind of a neck and neck. This is dry land work, but we had, I guess 2 years probably where we had some pretty darn good rain. And the group 3s looked pretty darn good, even as a late May planted option. By the time we got into June, those earlier or shorter maturity beans kind of drop off, and they're not as competitive as the 4 and 5. So, that's why, when guys ask, what to plant, plant a group 4, can't plant a group 4, plant a group 5. Most of our work has been done with early group 5s. They tend to come off just a little bit sooner. Some of these are also indeterminate growth habits, and they can tolerate, dry weather just a little bit more than the old determinate type beans. So like a 5.0, 5.1, some 5.3s are indeterminate growth habit 5s, and they have a real good fit. So I did want to make one comment. I know some of you said you had irrigation. There may be some folks that intended to put corn under irrigation and ended up going to soybeans, but in future, for folks that ask, we have also looked at this type of work under irrigation. And one of the things that we found was that a group 3 actually does extremely well as a June planted or a late plant option under irrigation. It actually, based on our work, is more stable even than a group 5, which is different than what we see in this dry land work. It allows you to harvest earlier. Yields are good. So it actually has a really good fit as a late planted irrigated option, but not dry land. So I think we're probably going to be looking at close to 2 million acres of soybeans this year. We've probably increased our planting intention by about 400,000 acres. And I know farmers probably had already booked seed. And then the Dicamba thing happened, and then everybody kind of went, okay, now what are we supposed to do? But my understanding is there's plenty of seed out there to meet the needs of guys that are, continuing, that will be planting or picked up some extra acres, but it's going to be Roundup Ready Extend. There are probably some Roundup Ready varieties, plenty of those out there. I think limited Liberty Link or that Liberty glyphosate tolerant, I think that seed went early. I don't know that any of that's really available right now. And the Enlist beet seed, I think all of that probably sold whatever they were, and companies intended to sell in Tennessee. But one of the things that obviously folks can use is we've got our variety test data on UT crops. And I know y'all have shared all of this information with your guys. One of the things that I sent out last week, I believe I emailed out a link to the University of Arkansas. They call it a cross-reference guide for soybeans. And this year, I know especially when folks they're looking at our UT variety data and they're picking out the good beans, but then they check and that seed is not available. In some cases, there are other companies that sell the same genetics. It's just sold under a different product name. And in Tennessee, breeder codes that describe the parentage of each variety, regardless of the brand name that it's sold under, those are not public. In Arkansas, they are. And so Arkansas gets a list of the breeder codes, and they match up across varieties to put this cross-reference guide out. And so some of these varieties, may not be sold in Tennessee, but, if you focus on the ones that are maybe in our variety trial, a number of those do make the list. But basically the way it works is like you look, and this is just a kind of a snip of the document, but you basically look for a specific variety, and then you follow across the row, and everything in that row across from that variety is basically the same genetics. It's just offered by a different company. So that's kind of how it works, and it's another kind of a handy thing to help locate seed for guys that are still looking for beans and trying to cover all their acres. Just a couple of things For later planted beans, I think farmers already plant just about everything on a narrow row, but definitely a good practice with later planted soybeans. I would also suggest, if they can afford it, to go ahead and at least put a fungicide seed treatment on their beans. I don't know what the weather's going to do, but if it keeps like this, where it's wet and hot, or wet and cool, or whatever June turns out to be, that is hard on beans, and diseases can jump all over seed that are not treated. So if they can pencil it in, if they can at least put some kind of a fungicide treatment on those later beans, I think they'll be better off. I have seen a couple of fields here recently that were planted without, and stand looks awful. Just not a good thing. I mean, fungicides are not bulletproof. I mean, they're not going to protect from a huge amount of disease, but it's still, I think, better than not putting anything out on at all on those seed, when we're dealing with conditions like this. So a fungicide seed treatment, I think, is a good idea. Let me see, there was something else I was going to mention. As far as planting rates, I think some of our data, with planting rates is a little bit older, but one of the things that you all know, that a lot of times guys now they'll load up a seed with all kinds of products. It does a great job of helping to protect yield, and we don't have to plant more seed, even with the later planting necessarily. If they're planting into wheat stubble, where they're not able to get seed in the ground, or in the spring, if they're planting into cover crops, sometimes I might bump my seeding rate up a little bit, just because I know that it's more challenging to get seed in the ground, period. But under, halfway clean fields, they don't have to go up to, 200,000 seeds to the acre or anything like that. I mean, we're sticking probably with our similar, our same seeding rates. Again, I think the calls that I've had this year have been related to weather. I think the picture on the top left, these are some April planted beans, and we had a lot more skips in our stand. This wasn't really even a wet field. It was just kind of a function of the year. So thinner stands, skippier stands. We ended up keeping these because we ended up with about, I think it was an average of about 75,000 plants to the acre, which was a keeper. So skippier stands. I know Heather's gotten calls on seedling diseases, a little bit of slug damage here and there. We had I think this is bean leaf beetle, a lot of beetles and a lot of feeding damage in some of our plots, but I don't know that farmers have sprayed for these much. I think last week, Scott Stewart mentioned the three-cornered alfalfa hopper because it's a wet year, to be on the lookout for large numbers of those, and maybe scout and treat if you need to. But, those are kind of some of the things that I've been getting calls about. Kind of similar to corn, with soybeans that are planted late. If it turns dry, we may not have as much foliar disease. If it stays wet, we're probably going to have more disease, especially in some of these later planted beans. Typically more insect pressure in those as well. So hopefully if you're a farmer, you're looking at your beans, or you got somebody that can take a look and kind of give you a little bit of a heads up when there's, some things start to appear on the horizon. And I know there's lots of information on the web as far as insect management and disease control and disease identification and all those. But I think the anticipation is because we have shifted so much of our acreage to this late window, that we're going to be looking probably at some more inputs on these soybeans. The key is, I think, to kind of keeping an eye on the fields and putting out, what needs to be put out, and putting them out on time. So Um, any questions about soybeans from anybody? Okay, well, if not, so I sat down with Larry a few minutes ago and wrote some stuff down and tried to type some stuff into a slide, but we were really hoping there would be some kind of some news coming from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture today, but it has not. I think a lot of you were on the call last week, on the roundtable call, where Larry talked about the June 3rd ruling that basically canceled Extendamax, Ingenia, and Vexapan applications in crop in those 9th district states. And the result was that companies that produce the products basically stopped sending the products to retail outlets. And so everything kind of happened on the 3rd of June. So in Tennessee, retailers, sold all of what they had on hand to farmers and depleted what they had inventory wise, and now they're not getting any new product from companies because they've stopped sending material, kind of waiting for the EPA to tell everybody what their stand is on all of this. So it's as of before lunch, we didn't have any news from TDA. I think they're waiting for EPA to tell them what to do. But right now, they're still saying that if you have a producer and they bought their products and, that they have a label and they will be covered if they spray your beans. Retailers, it's kind of a gray area whether retailers have the ability to make these applications, even if they had product in inventory, because it's after the 3rd of June. I don't know. It's a lot of stuff going on there. I'm saying that probably retailers are not spraying anymore, or they don't have anything to spray. So in our state, I think everybody's looking at the Tennessee Department of Agriculture for guidance. And I think there are meetings today, and they're trying to put some kind of message out, but we just haven't heard anything yet. Bottom line is we've got almost 2 million acres of beans, and I would say 80% at least are extend beans. So, and we don't have near enough product to spray everything with dicamba. So Larry mentioned a product called Tavium, which is a Syngenta product. It did not get it was not included on that original 2018 label, so it is actually still on the market and still registered for use in dicamba tolerant beans, but the supply is not very large. I think I was in his office earlier, and he was talking to one of the retailers, and I think they had less than 10,000 acres worth of product. And then until Syngenta can, put more of this stuff out, that's really not going to be an option there either. So, what this means is that unless something changes, we go back to trying to manage weeds without dicamba, which means looking at older chemistries. I think I looked in the weed control manual. Cobra, Flexstar, and Blazer, I think, were the go-to products for water hemp before we had dicamba. Liberty, obviously, and Liberty Link beans, but I think it's it doesn't look like, at least right now, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to access, farmers who don't have these products are not going to be able to access these products this year, unless something major changes very soon. So,
Angela, are you familiar, I guess, with the EPA ruling that came out, the order that they came out yesterday afternoon? I figured y'all had seen that.
Yes, I don't remember all of the details. I think my understanding was that it was still leaving some of the decisions up to the states as far as what they wanted to do with the product that was in the state. Was that your interpretation?
Well, I've got it in front of me here. Looking at said that growers, you talked about commercial applicators. They had a statement in here. It says growers and commercial applicators may use existing stocks that were in their possession June the 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
And that they says they can use them through previously approved label and may not continue after July 31st.
Mm-hmm.
So when you mention commercial, they're grouped in there with growers. So I guess that means what that reads, unless we hear something different from the Department of Ag, that the commercial applicators and growers, if they had it on hand June the 3rd, could use that supply.
Yes, but I heard, I guess Monday, I had a couple of people call, and one was a chemical rep, and he said he'd been, I guess, calling on retailers, and he was told they weren't going to spray. They just quit, and this was a directive from their administration to just basically shut everything down. And I don't know whether they had product on hand, and maybe we're going to sell it to farmers and let them spray. So yeah, it looks like that June 3rd. I know there was some product probably sold after the 3rd, like on the 4th when we had our roundtable meeting, because people were kind of scrambling, trying to get stuff. But, I think anything that the farmers got access to last week, they can continue to spray. And I'm guessing that retailers can if they want to, but I guess what I was hearing is that there were retailers that saying they were not going to spray. So I think, I think the concern obviously is not enough material to cover all the acres. And, we're sure hoping that changes. But, right now we're just kind of in limbo on what to tell folks to do. Looking at some of these older technologies, nobody's real excited about that. You got to go out early. You got to go out on small weeds. And, I think we're just kind of, this is the situation that we're in. And until, I guess, EPA decides what they're going to do, the companies are not going to send any more product to retail outlets. So we're just.
But let me ask you, if a retail outlet has it today and a producer needed it, can they still sell it, or is it sort of a gray area too?
That's the gray area. Larry said his understanding is they were not supposed to sell it after the 3rd of June to a farmer. Now, some probably may have been sold on the 4th. I don't know. But I think his interpretation is that even if they had it, they're not supposed to sell it to a farmer. But they could, they might be able to spray it since it was something that they had on hand as of June 3rd, right? The retailer did. But I guess what I'm hearing is the retailers don't have product. They sold everything they had or sprayed it or whatever, and they don't have it. So some of this is rumor and speculation. But again, we're sure hoping that someone with the Department of Ag comes through real soon and just kind of puts a statement out to clarify some of these things. And the other thing is the EPA is going to have to move on something. They're going to have to make a decision to do something, either tell companies, okay, we'll let you finish the season out, go ahead and send the product. We'll let you finish the season out, or or not. So that's a lot more about what I don't know, I think, than what I do know. But I guess that's kind of the situation that we're in. Any other questions? Or
I was just going to make a clarification. This Ninth Circuit Court, that's really on the West Coast: California, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, Montana, Washington, Arizona, and
it is
Alaska included. But you know, just like TDA mentioned last week, we are a labeled state, you know, until we get orders from EPA, you know, we're still allowed to use it as the label states.
Yes.
I guess one concern that I have about the issue is maybe that more economic impact. A lot of the producers had already invested a lot of money. You know, there's millions of acres that are going to be impacted. And what's it going to do to our food supply? So those are just some of my concerns.
Well, you know, I think it's, you know, if we dial back a couple of years before we had Dicamba, you know, we're going to go back to that kind of situation where you're trying to kind of piece together a weed control program to do a pretty good job. And some of these older I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at some of the cost of some of these. It may cost more by the time you throw 2 or 3 things together. You know, I think it's the money invested in the seed, because Extend soybeans are not cheap. You know, they have a pretty hefty price tag on them, and they're not going to be able to use the products that you know they were supposed to be able to use in that expensive seed. So I don't know. You know, I think Larry may have mentioned it Friday. I mean, you know, lawsuits, you know, everybody's hollering lawsuits. I know Bayer is pushing back against the June 3rd ruling, trying to get it reversed. I guess they're appealing it or whatever. They're also, you know, kind of on the forefront with EPA to try to get them to move and do something to allow farmers, at least farmers outside of this Ninth Circuit Court area, to, you know, do what they need to do this year in crops. So, I mean, I don't know. It's, I try to be optimistic. They've got to do something soon. They can't sit on this for a month. And so I'm fingers crossed. I'm hoping we hear something by Friday. They'll give us maybe a little bit better idea of what's going on. I did want to remind y'all, I think I hid this slide, but soybean yield contest, we're going to do this again this year, and had pretty good turnout last year and some really good yields. I know with a lot of beans, you know, some folks are not just real excited about a yield contest, but we are going to have a June winner. So a guy that plants beans dry land and irrigated in June will have a winner out of that group as well. So, you know, this isn't for everybody, and I understand, you know, y'all got a lot going on in the fall, but you've got producers that like to tinker with yields and, you know, try different things and just kind of see how they can push stuff. You know, this might be something that they can do. Entry form is due in August, so they got time to think about it and pick a field. But just kind of wanted to remind y'all that that's going to be out there in this year. So, any other questions? Or I know we almost used an hour. So, well, if not, appreciate y'all joining me today. And if you think of anything that you didn't ask, give me a call or send me an email, and we can chat. So,
Thank you, Dr. McClure, for joining us today. I was also going to remind everybody, we have an awesome website, utcrops.com. The specialists have a blog that they put out. It is updated and kept current. And then also, Mile No-Till is still a go for this year, Thursday, July 23rd. So you can visit milan.tennessee.edu for more information on myelin no-till. I know the specialists have been working hard to get everything available online. Today, or this year's theme is Spare the Plow, Save the Soil. So I'll be looking forward to going to myelin no-till virtually this year. But thank you, Angela, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. We'll see y'all later.